so continuing talking about like particularly working with oppressed communities, particularly when we're talking about like working with LGBTQ folks, I find most often folks again like they come to say that thing like I had someone I used to work with and she's like, listen, I have a lesbian client, tell me how to speak to her, right? Like there is no special coded language, but it's important to think about not only like again, it's important to anticipate the barriers that folks may experience, right?
This video is.
And so when we're thinking about some barriers for LGBTQ students for reporting and just coming forward, one is the fear of being outed, right? Depending on who it is or what the community is, like a lot of times there is the fear of being outed. And so thinking about like what are the barriers for that? And even beyond the fear of being outed as LGBTQ, there's a fear of being outed as a survivor, right? A lot of folks don't necessarily want everyone to know. There's also the fear of losing community support. So again, communities are small. Like even in the biggest of cities, like a lot of times, like communities can be very like self-contained. So again, remembering you're most likely to be sexually assaulted by someone you know and trust. So someone within your small like support network sexually assaults you. What do you do then, right? Because disclosing could mean that like you lose that support community that you have. And so it's about working with students and thinking about how they can continually build that support and other different ways to get support. And then the other piece is that another large barrier that folks like encounter are microaggressions and master status, right? And so when we're talking about microaggressions, so these are the like everyday things that people say that are offensive, whether or not they intend them to be. And so these are the things that people say on a regular basis that really communicate sort of really communicate like a lack of respect and really an oppression, you know. And so I also like to highlight there's this great Tumblr blog. They no longer update, but I love them. They're called Anti-Oppressive Baby Animals, and I try to use them throughout. And so you have the little cat thing. Let's unpack that, right? And so this is what folks experience most often, is that most people do not intend to be offensive. They do not intend to be oppressive. But the intent is not as important as the impact. And so paying attention to the things that people say that really communicate sort of like, I'm not like welcomed here or I'm not sort of trusted. And so this one blog they got a lot of like LGBTQ folks and they asked them to sort of hold up signs displaying what are some microaggressions people have said to them. And so this guy is saying you can't really say, he's gay, but he's like the greatest guy in the world, right? And so what is the hidden message behind that?
It's not okay to be gay.
Absolutely. It's not okay to be gay. What's the other one? Most gay people aren't great, right? Like, that's like, you know, that was a huge hurdle like he had to work around by being great and gay, right? And so I'm sure the person, when they said that to him, did not intend to be offensive at all. But the intent versus the impact, like, it really isn't as important. When we think about some other microaggressions, particularly when we're talking about like transgender folks, is misgendering them, right? So I'm coming here, I'm presenting myself as female, I say my pronouns are she and her. Everything about you, and everything that I have communicated to you has indicated that my preferred pronouns are she and her. And if you find out, like, let's say that I'm a trans woman and like my sex assigned at birth was different, and you misgender me as he, right? That's an act of violence. That communicates disrespect. Now everybody makes mistakes, right? And if you are ever like unsure about someone's gender pronoun, it's okay to ask, right? Particularly, I always sort of stress when we're doing, like if you're doing classes and groups where you're going around and having everybody introduce themselves, have everybody say their preferred gender pronoun. Like that is something so simple, but it really means a lot. Like this has been consistent from trans folks consistently again and again. They say like misgendering, like that hurts. Like that is an act of violence. So that is showing that like I do not respect your identity. And so if you mess up, just say I'm sorry and correct yourself and really try to work on, you know, not doing it a second time. But thinking about all the different things that people say that are meant to be helpful that really aren't. Different things like, oh, I am so comfortable. Like I have a cousin that's just like you, so we can talk about all this stuff. Like what does that mean? right? Like you're not actually paying attention to who they are, but just you're paying attention to one aspect of their identity that you find most fascinating. Or different things like are relying on stereotypes about, you always think about like Willie Grace Jack, right? And so thinking about like very like super like effeminate, flamboyant, into fashion for like gay men. Like this is a really common thing. Like I always tell folks like queer folks, LGBTQ folks aren't like your pocket gay friend. And so a lot of times people will say things that are meant to say like, oh, I'm a really big supporter, I love Ellen DeGeneres. What does that have to do with me, right? And so it's like, I'm coming to you for academic advising. What does that have to do? Like your love of Ellen DeGeneres, like how does that impact my life? But what, again, this shows that this is where your preoccupation is. And so it's really, microaggressions go across like gender, sexuality, class, like ability, like this happens again and again. And so what it means is that you need to be very cognizant about what you're saying and why you're saying it. Like, are you really being helpful, or are you just saying something because you're curious?
And usually because you're uncomfortable
Absolutely.
around being about being around that kind of person.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it shows uncomfortability. Or sometimes what I also find is like fascination. I always say it's like the magical gay unicorn, right? And so like this happens all the time. And so where people are like, oh my goodness, this is great, you are so sparkly and new, like tell me everything about you. And you're not just like, I'm just trying to get a class. Like, I'm just trying to get a bagel. Like, this is not my purpose right here is to educate you in the moment. And that happens time and time again. Like, people are so fascinated. When I was in grad school, my thesis was on Black queer studies, right? And the people, like the administration in my graduate school did not treat me well and were not really like a fan of me doing Black queer studies. But whenever it was time to talk about the research that was being done, they were ready to pop me out, and they're like, listen, this is what Elise is going to does research on, right? It's that microaggression, like the not real support, but I'm going to act like I'm supporting. And so particularly when you're thinking about working with survivors, right? If someone is coming to you, they're disclosing an assault, other aspects of their identity, like that's not as important. What are they coming to you for? What are they asking you for? Like that's what you need to be paying attention to. And so, similarly, this is a really great organization called Forge Forward. And they work particularly with transgender, like gender nonconforming communities, particularly around sexual violence. They have tons of free webinars that you can go on their website and just get in different fact sheets. And so I pulled this from one of their fact sheets about master status, right? And so master status is talking about like the tendency of observers to only to believe that one label or demographic category is more significant than any other aspect of the observed person's background. So that's what you're paying attention to. Again, like that is what's most present in your mind, and not really thinking about them as a whole person or what are they coming to you for. And so here's an example that they give. So a 22-year-old man of transgender history, living as male for 5 years, assigned female at birth, was sexually assaulted by his college basketball coach. The same nurse, when she learned 20 minutes into their discussion that he had a transgender history, literally chastised him for not immediately informing her, the advocate in the front triage desk, that he was transgender, right? And so the same nurse, the nurse that's performing the evidence collection kit when he went to the hospital, right? And so this is a part of his master status. Like he was there as a survivor in that moment. He needed to have the kit done. But what was her preoccupation? His gender identity, right? And so if you're going to a hospital today to have an evidence collection kit done, there is one evidence collection kit regardless of what your genitalia looks like. There was no need for him to identify himself before or after. What he needed right in there in that moment was support around his assault. But she was then focused on his gender identity and his history, right? Because that made her uncomfortable. And in that moment, he didn't get the services that he needed because she was so preoccupied with his gender identity. That's how master status really comes into play and really blocks folks from getting services, right? And so if someone is coming to you, like let's say you're like the counselor or something, and someone's coming to you to talk about their sexual assault, and you're more focused on their gender identity, their sexuality, or other things that have nothing relevant to what they're talking to you about, you're not actually serving them. That's a part of master status, right? And so this happens a lot with a lot of folks from different oppressed communities. And these are the things that we that happen so often that folks don't necessarily recognize. We also see master status show up when people ask really prying questions, right? Particularly for LGBTQ folks, folks find out that you're LGBTQ and they feel like your body and your sexual orientation is now public domain. They can ask you really prying questions about your genitalia, about your sex life, all these different things on a regular basis, right? And so the majority of time, these people do not intend to be offensive. But the impact is that no other aspect of who they are is as important as that one part of their identity that you feel is most important or most interesting. That's what happens also when you make people the magical sparkly unicorn, right? Like, that's what you're focusing on instead. I have another presentation I actually have, like, a sparkly unicorn that I throw in as well. But, like, this is really, like, these are the things that you need to pay attention to as well. And so how do you support survivors, right? And so one, it's important to recognize that, like, surviving the assault is just the first piece, right? Getting through the assault is just the first piece. It's also thinking about all the other fears that survivors may be encountering. The fear that they may not be believed, right? And so again, we live in a society where routinely on TV and conversations at coffee shops, we hear people doubt survivors of sexual violence. So when someone else is sexually assaulted, and I'm going to go share my story, all those things are also playing through their minds. One, to think about their privacy, right? And so when you're working with students, it's so important for you to tell them what is the limit of the confidentiality that you can hold. Do you have to share this information? And who are you sharing it with? And what are they doing with that information? That is so important. As clear like consent as you can give them around sort of what they're telling you and where that information is going is so important. One, folks may be afraid of being viewed differently, being viewed as weak, right? Being viewed as like they somehow caused this. And this is a really hard piece, right? And so when someone is telling you about an assault, and particularly as like a former like the sexual assault crisis counselor, like I heard some of the most horrifying things ever, right? But it's important that when I'm hearing those things, that I didn't show shock, that I didn't start crying, I didn't show any sort of thing. I just needed to be there for them. I needed to like hold that space for them and allow them to get the support that they needed. Because whatever your facial expressions are, it may mean one thing to you, but they may be perceiving it as something completely different. So paying attention to how they may be interpreting the way you're reacting as the way that you view them. A lot of folks don't want to be pitied as well. And so just because someone is sexually assaulted doesn't mean that you need to coddle them and hold them and rock them like they're babies. I've seen that happen before, right? It's also important that some folks may fear for their safety and additional violence. My supervisor always tells this story about working with one woman like in the hospital, like right after a gang rape. And then while they're in the hospital, she's getting multiple text messages from the perpetrators saying, this is your daughter's name, this is the school that she goes to, you get her off the bus at this time. If you tell anyone, I'm going to come and get you, right? And so in that moment, that young woman was like, I can't tell anybody, right? I can't report this to the police because my life is in danger, right? And so thinking about, do they fear for their additional safety? Like all of those things are really important. And again, the fear of being blamed and judged is so present. We see it all the time. We see it with the UVA case and like Rolling Stone, right? Whenever there's a high profile case, there's always a debate. Everyone's talking about, oh, this sexual assault, like was this person telling the truth or not? And all those judgments, like I always say, survivors are always listening. Just because someone hasn't identified to you as a survivor doesn't mean that they aren't. And so it's also important to think about some more statements that are meant to be helpful. They just really aren't, right? So I know how you feel. You shouldn't feel that way. At least you weren't hurt. Try to calm down. It could have been worse. Time heals all wounds. Everything is going to be all right. And try to get on with your life, right? These are all things said with the best of intent, but the impact is very different. This communicates that, one, you're minimizing their experience, right? You shouldn't feel that way. However survivors feel in the moment is that's how they feel, and that's acceptable. There is no one standard reaction to trauma. Everyone's reaction to trauma is the right reaction, right? The try to calm down, It could have been worse. You hear that a lot. Well, at least you weren't really hurt, right? Just because there are no physical, like, bruises, broken bones, or anything like that doesn't mean that the feeling of trauma isn't just as severe. Even similarly, just because there was an attempted rape and not a completed rape, doesn't mean that their response to that trauma is going to be any different, right? And so allowing people to, like, communicate however they feel about the trauma, whatever they went through, and allowing that to be okay is really important. So you can't see this. And so what is survivor's needs, right? And so one, it's important to think about disclosures versus reporting. And so we may be discussing something in class, right, that triggers something about my assault. And so I just want to say to you afterwards, like, hey, it really reminded me of, like, this assault that I went through. That's not necessarily saying I want you to do anything about it or anything like that. I just need to tell someone. And so that's a disclosure. When someone is reporting, they're saying, listen, I need to know my options. I want you to do, like, I'm seeking some type of action. And so it's really important to think about the differences between the two. And so it's also important to think about, one, survivors may not actually know what they want in the moment, right? So it just happened. I don't really know what I want, but I just need to tell somebody, and I need to find out what my options are. Who can I talk to? What will that process look like? All of that is important information to know. Again, your response, particularly if you're the first person that someone is disclosing to, that has a great impact on whether or not they will disclose to anyone else ever, right? On our hotline, we get calls from people routinely who are in their 60s, 70s, and they say, this happened when I was 5 years old, and you're the first person I'm telling since I told my mom, and she didn't believe me, right? Like, if someone gets a negative reaction from their first disclosure, they are less likely to ever disclose that assault again, right? Question?
What gives me a lot of stress is it's so important to respond in a helpful way.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see myself saying everything's going to be all right.
Yeah,
And,
Yeah.
I agree.
and I look at that and like, I could have said that.
Yeah.
So now I feel very stressful about what to say that is, productive and helpful. And I understand listening. But
Mhm.
at some point you have to say something. And I'm very concerned with the looks on my face.
Yeah.
Because if I show too much empathy and sympathy, then it might seem as if, I'm very concerned about that moment because it is so important. And so when we say, what do I say? It's because we're worried about saying the wrong thing even with the right intentions. We almost kind of do want some kind of script or
Yeah.
because really I could have easily said, time heals all wounds, or
Yeah.
it's going to be okay. And now I'm finding out that would be hurtful.
Yeah, and listen, you're going to mess up, right? And so I've said things that weren't the most helpful. But what I find the most helpful is, what do you need from me? And I'm here for you. Simple, right? Like, what do you need? And I'm here.
Another one, I'm so sorry this happened to you.
Absolutely.
That validates what their feelings, and sometimes that's all they need. I'm sorry this happened to you. I don't think you believe me.
Yeah, absolutely. And the facial expressions is hard. Like, I'm a person, my friends are constantly yelling at me to fix my face, right? They're like, oh my goodness, so-and-so walked in the room with your face. I'm like, I didn't recognize. And that's something you have to practice, right? One of my coworkers talks about, like, talking to her parents about sex, right? Like, to really work on, like, schooling, like, her uncomfortability, like, when she's talking to them. Like, that's what some of the practice. And so what's really important, though, is to never minimize, right? And so to think about what you're saying, and thinking about, like, what do you really want to say? Because, like, it's okay, it's going to be all right. It's so common. But I've also had, like, survivors be like, but it's not okay. Like, it's not going to be all right. Because we can't guarantee that. When I do trainings with law enforcement, I always tell them, you can't guarantee that there's going to be an arrest, that this person is going to be prosecuted, right? Like, all you can say is that I'm here for you, and I'm willing to, like, do the best that I can for you. What do you need from me?
There's something called active listening, mirroring their feelings,
Yeah.
and using iMessages and not being judging, and this is from the 1970s. I remember Thomas Gordon, teacher effectiveness training, parent effectiveness training, the books, and Chaim Benat from the 60s, between parent and child. There were ways to deal with it without being judgmental.
Absolutely. Yeah, and
There's skills you have to learn about
Listen.
how to talk.
Mirroring the language is really important, right? And so, like, like I hear you saying you're really upset. Like, what can I do to help you with that? What do you need from me? Like, those are the things I always feel like, what do you need from me? Because that's why I'm allowing them to dictate what this looks like. If you just need to listen, and sometimes that's all that happens. We get constantly, like on the hotline, people call and say, I just need to talk. I just need somebody to listen to me and hear me and believe me, right? And that sometimes that's all they need. And it's also important to know that survivors' needs may change, right? And so they may come to you and one thing like, listen, I don't want to report. All I really need to know, like, just let know my options. Then they may change and say, actually, I do want to report. And so being able to go with that. And it could go vice versa. Like allowing them to know that this process is fluid and that it can change, right? And that they are really sort of leading that is really important.
I have a question. If they could confess something to you that something happened to them,
Mhm.
and then they don't want to report it, are you now obligated to report it?
I don't know, are all of you responsible employees?
All you have to do is fill out the disclosure form and give it to me.
Or why don't we just back there?
Yes,
Yeah.
we're gonna go over that at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, it depends on the, like, universities. Some universities, everybody, like, has to report, right? And to go all through all the chain. And so if that was you, like, if that was the case, I would say letting people know that ahead of time. And so when sex counselors were mandated reporters, right? And so we frequently get calls from parents and saying, like, hey, my child was sexually assaulted. So by them telling me that, I now have to make a DCF report. And so what I say is like, okay, we can talk about this, but I need to let you know I'm a mandated reporter. This is the information I'm going to take, and this is what I'm going to say to DCF. If they're like in person, you're like, you want to sit with me while I'm making the report, but it's always important to let them know, like, if you can't hold that information confidential, who are you going to tell and what that's going to look like? Did you have your hand up?
I did. One of the things that I think we all would struggle with is we're all used to advising, and that's not necessarily what they want.
Absolutely.
Right? Giving advice is what we do all the time, and I found myself struggling with that. You know, how do you not advise someone when you're trained to advise someone? Right?
Yeah.
And sometimes they just want to talk.
Yeah. And that's the hardest piece, particularly when you see folks, and like, what's the hardest thing, I don't personally believe in objectivity, right? Like, we all have our own stuff, and we could try, but we're never going to get it 100%. But it's really important to take yourself out of this as much as possible. And that's really hard when you see people making decisions that you don't think are the right ones, right? But you got to remember, like, empowerment. Our advocates with the sex offender supervision units, right? And so one of my coworkers was saying, like, it was really hard. She talked to one young girl who was, like, assaulted by, like, her father. And he was, like, on parole. He had been arrested and everything like that, and they had a no-contact order. And she was like, listen, I don't want this no-contact order anymore. Like, I want you to advocate to get this taken off. And so my coworker was like, that was so hard for her. That is not what she thought was best in the moment. But she needs to be like, if that's what you want, then I have to support you with that. And so let's see how we can do this and keep you as safe as possible. And that's the really hard part, is not giving advice and not disempowering them in that point. It's just really listening, seeing what they want, and going along with that.
Should you make them aware that you're a mandatory reporter immediately so they don't feel as if they've been, what's the word? Compromised or, yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, they might feel like they're revealing something to you that you're now forced to tell higher ups, and
Yeah.
they may not want it.
Absolutely. And so we do that, like, again, we do that a lot on the hotline. So if a kid calls, right, and you can hear in their voice that they're pretty young, you can say, listen, we can talk, but I need to let you know that I'm a mandated reporter. And so I will need to contact DCF with X, Y, and Z information. That means sometimes they don't give me that information, right? And that's fine. That means sometimes they choose not to continue that conversation. But honestly, 9 times out of 10, people say, that's okay. Like, I still want to talk. But just allowing them to know that ahead of time, or as soon as you are aware that they're going to give you, like, any sort of information you may need to report, like, is really important. So again, like, if an adult calls a hotline, like, I don't necessarily have to report like that. But if they start talking about a child, then that's when I need to say, here's the limits of my confidentiality. Like, I can't hold this. And so it's important to recognize, to remember, like, who are the confidential people on this campus that students can go to, right? And directing them towards them. Like, listen, I can't keep all this information confidential, but this is who can. If you want, I can walk you to their office, right? This is the things that you can do with the limits to your confidentiality.
Betray, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's true. Like, that's a big issue. All right. And so, again, thinking about some of the campus responses that are available to survivors, right? And so I went on your website, which is great. And I said earlier, it was easily accessible, so I could go, and if I was in crisis, figure out, like, who I can talk to, right? And so, one, you have safety, right? And so you can talk about like if you need to, if someone's feeling that their safety isn't available, like is it compromised, you can work with them to negotiate that. Like you need to call the police, campus security, what do you need to do? Healthcare, you don't have like healthcare on campus, but I saw that there was referrals on where they could go, and that was clearly laid out. Like that's important information. Mental health care, I saw that there is crisis counseling here on campus. Again, saying like here, if you want to talk to someone short term, this is who you can talk to, right? And so you can say, give them the options of on campus or off campus as well, connecting them to like long-term care as well. Academics, so this is what we see, well, a lot of survivors, they're like, listen, I don't want to be in the same class with this person. Can we move my class? Or I was assaulted and I can't really function and like handle going through this class again. I need to drop it. Like that's part of things that you can provide them. Support around law enforcement, and everyone can provide ongoing support and check-ins. So that's not saying like, hey, how are you doing after that assault? But it's just saying, hey, how are you doing? If there's anything I can help you with? These are all important. What we hear a lot from survivors is they say immediately after assault, everybody's around, right? People are checking in on them, but a month, 2 months later, there's nobody. And they still need support then. And so it's just checking in, literally just picking up a phone, how are you doing? Seeing them in the halls, do you need anything? You want to go for coffee? Whatever you can do. Just letting them know that you're still there to support them is really important. And so it's important to think about, one, that like navigating all these systems are rough, right? Not a lot of people are used to this. It can be very daunting. And so just supporting them is really important. And remember, survivors are dependent on other people's support to get through this. And so when we're talking about responding to disclosures, a couple of things are really important. Is that one, you want to be non-judgmental. We talked a little bit about that earlier. So you don't want to say things like, what were you doing? Why didn't you get out of the car? Why did you get in the car? Why did you do X, Y, and Z? You want to listen and show as little shock as possible. You want to be honest about your confidentiality. What can you do with this information? We talked about that already. You want to be supportive, right? Listen and offer choices that empower them. And you want to be informed. And so knowing your process, and Jessica said you're going to go through like the disclosure forms and everything later, like knowing what that looks like, because as much as you can give them a heads up for what this process is going to look like, the better it's going to be. And so again, this is where we're talking a little bit about Title IX. And so whoever they designate as like responsible employees. And again, and so the responsible employees are designated by the school, but these are the people who have to do the reporting. And so what they say that responsible employees should be able to do, I also say all employees should be able to do, right? So clearly tell the victim your ability to maintain confidentiality. Provide information on the entire process. Deal with how the victim is feeling before trying to move them through the process. This is a big one, and I struggle with this a lot when I work with like correctional officers, right? And so I was like, okay, let's say like particularly I work with the juvenile detention officers. And so I'm like, let's say you have a youth and they disclose that they were sexually assaulted. What do you do next? They're like, well, I got to fill out this form. I got to call my supervisor. I got to do this, and that, right? But take a step back. Before you do all those things, before you file all these reports, remember you have a person standing in front of you disclosing something that's really hard to disclose. And so be very present in the moment. Check not only on their physical safety, but their emotional safety, right? So how are you feeling right now? Do you need somebody to be with you at home? Who can you call? How can I support you through this process, right? Before you move on, never forget that you're actually talking to a person, right? And then be able to understand like the difference like between reporting on campus versus reporting in the police, right? And so we find this a lot with campuses that have like real police officers on their campus. Like as like campus security, just reporting to them isn't the same as filing a police report. And so recognizing that is different and being able to say like, if you want to file a police report to possibly have an arrest, then we need to talk to, Farmington Police or wherever like the assault happened to police officers. Like understanding that is really important. And so we're going to practice, right? And so I'm going to throw out 3 scenarios, and I want you to pay attention to what are 2 barriers that may exist for the survivor. What are 3 places that you can refer them for information and services? And what are 2 things your university could put into place to ensure that needs of other similar survivors are met? Okay? So I'll go over that again when we go to the scenarios. Can you all see this? I know the white is a little hard in the background. So in a conversation with a student that you have gotten to know over the semester, they disclosed that they were sexually assaulted the summer before entering the freshman year. The student discloses that their trauma history only in passing and does not provide any more details than sharing that a recent class discussion about the sexual assault made them think about what happened to them last summer. The student openly identifies as queer and has had a difficult time finding support since entering the campus community. Right? So what are two barriers that the student may face? Isolation, absolutely. What's another barrier?
Having a discussion in class.
Discussion in class, absolutely. That could be triggering. What's another barrier? Does there anybody have any others?
The incident happened before they were a student at the institution, so knowing who to do anything about it.
Absolutely. And so again, like it didn't happen sort of under your jurisdiction. So in terms of like the support services may be a little bit different. And another one I would actually throw up is lack of lack of support, right? And so who can they talk to outside? Like who do they do? It's indicated that they don't really have like friends or like a real support system, right? And so who can you refer them to? What are some resources?
Counseling center.
Counseling center, right? What's another one? Absolutely. You go to refer to them sex. Any others? Don't you all have like an LGBTQ group?
We do. Yeah.
That might be a great
Not
place for
right.
them. Yeah, that might be a great place for them to get some community support, right? And so what are two things that Tungsten could change to help support similar survivors? Or you may already have.
Students have to be aware of this,
Mhm.
the awareness out of what services we do have. Not all the students will have this information.
Yeah, awareness of services, right? What's another one?
Practice faculty, and you know, one of the things that I'm having a hard time with is, I'm a science teacher.
Mhm.
I'm not really good at psychology.
Mhm.
And if somebody comes to me with that kind of stuff, I'm going to forget everything you say that I shouldn't have said,
Mm.
because I only maybe will do it once in my
Yeah.
whole time. So I wish you would talk to us like we're not medical health professionals,
Mhm.
because we need tools that we won't forget.
Yeah. And again, like I said earlier, so important things that you can say is, how can I help you?
How can I help you? That's enough.
Yeah.
And don't, gee, it just bothers my mind to say, yeah, I'm gonna, you all know me, I always put my foot in my mouth. When someone comes to me, all I can say is, gee, I'm sorry, how can I help you? What do you need?
That's all you
That's
need.
it, that's perfect.
That's all you need.
Your first instinct was good.
Absolutely. And it's also important to recognize that if someone's coming to you, they're coming to you because they trust you.
Because they trust you.
So they already know like your personality, they already know all those different things about you, and so they trust you. And so your first instincts were absolutely dead on. That's exactly what you need to do. And that's nothing more, right? I'm not asking you to like do the counseling, like there are people here that can do that. All it is about like saying that and being able to point them to where they can go. So knowing everybody, when we say where they can go, counseling. Heard so many people say that. Like that's important. That's all you need to do to support survivors.
Linda, you could go right or left out of your door. Jessica's
That's
on
right,
one side
Jessica's
and
on
I'm
one
the other.
side, she's on the other. Absolutely. Wait a minute, and I'm.
Yeah.
I've got a question about, this particular incident brought up, teach English, and so we get composition students, and often get people identifying a similar sort of story that happened sometime in the past.
Yeah.
And often, without any sense of there being either, no particular incident in class brought up, and simply, they identify as, oh yes, well, I was a victim of sexual assault sometime in the past. Is that something we're required to report then? Because I'm curious, because they often are reporting it, they're not reporting it, they're simply identifying it, and you're often, at least in my experience, they have often as though it is something that has happened and been addressed and is now settled.
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
Well, right now, my understanding is to disclose, fill out the form, you do not, and you can say on the note, like on your paper or something, if you wish for further support, here's who you contact, you can have them come to me or Colleen, or you can put one of the cards, because they're right outside our offices. And you don't have to identify them by name, you could just put their initials. And the only reason why I'm asking for initials is because if they disclose in your class, and you think it's something in the past, but then they go to, say, Amy's class, and something else happens and they disclose, she has a disclosure form, I'm seeing a pattern of initials with a similar story, and that student might need more support than we actually realize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, this being English composition, it's also possible that the composition is fiction. How do you tell?
We address fiction versus nonfiction in if they, so they understand the genre, and if they were gonna go so far as to make it up, then there's something else going on, right? So yeah, most of what they don't write fiction typically,
Yeah.
and we make that distinction pretty clear in most courses.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, and this is becoming like a more and more like common thing, particularly in college classes, particularly if you're going to read something with a sexual assault in it. And so one, it's also important to give trigger warnings, right? So we're going to read something that's going to discuss the sexual assault. And so this is something you could do without necessarily singling out, like students saying, this next piece we're going to read is going to talk about sexual assault. If you want to talk to someone, here's the information, right? You can put it on your syllabus, you can have it up on the board, like in class. Having that information readily accessible is really important. And I would argue that would be something that would have been helpful in this class, right? Like saying ahead of time, something we may read may be triggering. If someone's just writing about it in like sort of their paper, again, that's more of a disclosure versus a report, and just having that information available saying, if anybody needs support, here's where you can go.
Yes, I have a student, and I talked to Jessica about that, because Jessica was very helpful,
Mhm.
but I wasn't quite sure what to do, because that situation happened before she came to Francis.
Mm-hmm.
But she was still going in that, getting through that situation, and she came to me several times, actually, and she needed housing to get away from her difficult situation,
Mm-hmm.
and she couldn't get any housing, she couldn't find anything, and she's living with her in-laws,
Mm-hmm.
but she's in a really bad situation, and so she wanted help, and she really wanted resources. So it's a tricky situation.
Absolutely.
Because, we felt the disclosure, but we couldn't do a report. Because
It's not an investigation.
Yeah.
That's the difference, that if it didn't happen on campus, we don't do any types of investigation.
Yeah.
But do you know where she could go to get housing?
I would contact.
Randall, that's the
Yeah.
folder
And
that
she
you
didn't want to go to a shelter, she said, because she has 2 kids, and she said shelters were not always very nice environments for families and
Yeah.
shelter. So she was looking for actually housing to get out of the in-laws
Yeah.
place.
I would contact again like Prudence Crandall for like shelter, but also you can contact the YWCA in New Britain, because they have a lot of contacts around and they deal with this a lot, and so that's something we see a lot with particularly survivors of sexual violence. If they're if the perpetrator wasn't like a spouse or anything, we don't have quote unquote sexual assault housing, right? But they do have contacts in terms of local areas about housing lists that are opening up or different things like that, and so just contacting them. And so they can work with them around getting that information.
Well, it was intimate partner violence.
Mhm.
So it was a spouse.
Yeah, and so then Prudence Crandall would be great. They could also connect them with that. Because they also have other information. There are different services around in terms of getting into quick housing as well.
Yeah.
So,
She came to see me and I referred her.
yeah. And so, again, that's great. You're not, everybody isn't necessarily going to have all the resources all the time here, but it's all about confident referrals. And really informed referrals are really important. So getting to know your local advocates and different things. And so you can not only say call Prudence Crandall, but you can call so-and-so at Prudence Crandall, or you can call, Jen Oliver at, at YWCA, right? It's about having really confident, informed referrals are really important as well. And so yeah, so we talked about the changes, and so we'll go to the next one. So you're in contact with a student whose behavior and appearance have started to concern you. The student is no longer attending class or work regularly, appears to be depressed, and has stopped participating in activities. She is employed on campus and writes for the campus newspaper. When you approach the student about her poor attendance, she shares that she thinks something bad happened to her at a party recently, but isn't sure and tells you she doesn't want to think about it. So what are some barriers?
Denial?
Denial. Absolutely. Any other barriers? Stigma. Great. Anybody else have anything? See, Jessica's like, hand is over.
That she's employed on campus.
Yeah. And then also the fact that she doesn't remember, right? That's a barrier. So if she wanted to make a report, she doesn't necessarily might not know who to make a report against, like what are the details as well. All right, what are some referrals you can make? So some of them are going to be saying for all of them.
The
Counseling center, right? Academic advising, right? And so if this assault, we'll talk about next about Title IX and Clery, but part of Title IX says that if a student needs to drop a class because of an assault, they should be able to drop the class without any penalty to themselves, right? And so contacting academic advising is really important as well. All right, so what are some changes? What do you think could help support this student?
Oh, the awareness campaigns.
Absolutely. Yeah, so help deal with like the isolation, right? So being aware that this happens, there's support. Any other changes you think? And also, again, the awareness also about being aware that she can drop a class, right? That's important information folks to have. To know that they have options. Because she may be fearful, like trying to juggle all this, and if you need to take a break, then that's okay.
Well, you don't even know if it happened with someone in that class.
Absolutely.
If that happened at a party.
Yeah.
Might not have anything to do with
Yeah.
school.
But it might be that she's not keeping up with her schoolwork, and so that she's having a difficult time, and that class might be the class that she just can't get through, and so she needs the ability to be able to drop it. Like when we have medical withdrawals for students.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here's the last one. An international student from your campus has been referred to you because they are interested in learning more about their options to report a sexual assault to the university. English is not their first language, so they need additional information about their options in order to make an informed decision. They're at the university on a student visa and also express concerns about how reporting might negatively impact the visa. And so this is a tricky one. This one has been coming up more and more. So what are some barriers? Language, right? Obviously. What else?
Family support.
Family support.
She's an international student.
Exactly. Immigration status, right? What are some referrals? Say again?
We have a foreign student advisor
Yeah.
on campus.
Absolutely. So that's a great place. What else?
Some place where she can have her language be translated.
Absolutely. So an interpreter, a translator, right? And so what are some changes that Tuxas could do to help support this student?
Information in different languages, not everything in English.
Absolutely. Anything else?
Well, somebody that understands their culture.
Absolutely. And so it's not only about language, but it's also about culture as well, right? These are all really important pieces. And so this is another one coming up that's coming up a lot because we'll move on right on to Title IX now. And so part of what Title IX says is that international students need support as well. And so we're talking about legal responsibilities. So one, we have Clery Act, and the Clery really just says, it's very simple, and it's really just about reporting all types of crime on campus, not just sexual assault, right? And so nuts and bolts, that's really, it's about reporting, and it's also about notifying the campus for like a threat, right? If they feel like an imminent threat, and that depends on the campus and how you define that. So when we talk about Title IX, Title IX, again, a lot of folks think about Title IX typically in sports, but it also involves sexual harassment and sexual violence. Title IX from the Office for Civil Rights said one instance of sexual violence makes a hostile environment, and then the university needs to do something to rectify that. And so lately, and you'll see a lot in the news, particularly because of UConn, right? Like Title IX has been in the news a lot. And so they also, the Office for Civil Rights has put out more information to sort of clarify what they mean. they can be very obtuse at times. And so first started in 2011, when they said, like, sent out a Dear Colleagues letter, where they said one incident of sexual assault creates an inequitable educational environment. One, they also said that some schools, when they're doing investigations, were using the same sort of level as police officers, right? Beyond a reasonable doubt. And most universities don't have the ability to do the same level of investigations. So they said preponderance of evidence that the statute should be used. So it is more likely that it did happen than it didn't, is the evidence that they should be using. All incidents of sexual assault must be investigated, and the university's responses should be victim-centered. So being victim-centered doesn't mean that means that automatically they're gonna like convict anyone that's accused and throw them out of school. But it means that it's really a better way to think about it is trauma-informed, right? Keeping in mind the ways that trauma affects students, thinking back to what we were talking about before, and making sure that your process minimizes that potential trauma, additional trauma, as much as possible. And so then last year, it was literally like a day or two before I had a presentation at, I think, like Western. OCR puts out another guidance where they put out like 54 pages of frequently asked questions. This is like one of the clearest things they have ever done, where they're literally like, what do you do with this? Well, this is how you should handle it. And so what this really gave a lot more guidance as well. And so one, they were talking about, again, addressing every single incident. I recently read a couple of like the resolutions from some universities around with their Title IX complaint. And what they're talking and what schools are getting sort of like called out on or chastised on are like not addressing every single issue. What they really stress throughout these pages is they want schools to start thinking about offending behaviors and patterns. And so similarly, like Jessica was saying in terms of getting those disclosure reports with the initials, right? And so she's getting several disclosure reports with initials, and those different initials are identifying the same perpetrator or the same area that this sexual assault has been happening, then that's a pattern. And so then the university needs to start looking at what can we do to decrease this pattern behavior. And so some schools, it's like certain like areas where people walk, certain like universities, certain sports teams. It's paying attention to these patterns of behaviors. And then it's also important that students, and particularly victims, are aware of every single aspect about what's going on. Not only their rights and options, but also what's going on throughout the process. I read, I think it was Princeton recently, had a Title IX investigation, and I read the resolution. And so what the OCR really called them out on is that they had one student who had went through the entire process, right? Her perpetrator had been found sort of like, was not guilty, guilty, but in different terms. And so he appealed, right? And so part of his initial punishment that he was kicked off campus for like a semester. And so she was like, okay, fine, like whatever, I'm gonna go about my life. But what they didn't tell her is that he appealed, and because he appealed, he was still on campus. And so she's walking around her class, like walking around going to classes, and she sees her perpetrator. And so they said, you didn't properly inform her that was going on, and so therefore you created a hostile environment, right? That's why it's so important to notify folks about what the process is going about. It's not saying, hey, don't actually kick them off campus or getting any changes. All she wanted to know is what was going on. Like that is I can't stress how important just basic information about the process and what's going on is. About not only resources, but everything that's going on from there. And so we'll go through a little bit quicker, is that one, all institutions, you have to investigate. Even if you find out via Twitter that a sexual assault happened, they even said it explicitly, like if you find out via social media that like an assault happens, you have to investigate that to the best of your abilities. And so that may be just asking around, like going and investigating. It may not get far, but you have to take some action. It talks about a little bit more about clarifying the Title IX coordinator's responsibilities and overseeing the not only complaints but like sort of investigations. Where before, like some schools, like nobody knew who their Title IX coordinator was. Title IX coordinator didn't even know what their job was supposed to be. Like all of that, they really clarified as well. And then also the school requires that protect the both parties equally, right? And so it protects the complainant from, by providing interim sanctions. So that means changing classes, if you have housing, changing housing, possibly whatever you need to do while you're investigating this process to protect them as much as possible. It also talks about being equitable on both sides, right? And so if I file a complaint against someone, that means that we both get no contact orders, right? And it's about everything that's being done is being done equitably. That means that if I get to have somebody at the hearing board, then the other person does as well. And we're really seeing a lot of schools not doing that. I think similarly in Princeton's resolutions, that was what one of the things they got cited on, is that the accused student was able to bring in all this evidence and all these people, and the complaining student wasn't able to bring in any of those people. And so it's talking about everything needs to be equitable on both sides. And it needs to make services accessible. It talks a lot about culturally competent services. They talk a lot about particularly services for LGBTQ students, international students, students who English isn't the first language, and students with disabilities. They talked about so much about making sure that services are as culturally competent as possible. And so again, paying attention to that power, that privilege, having places that students can report where they feel most comfortable. Talks a lot, and similarly when I was talking about international students, that one example that we gave, is that if I'm a student and I needed I think you need to carry 12 credits for your student visa, and I need to drop a class because I can't handle it because of a sexual assault, which in OCR is granted, they say you need to figure that out. They don't tell you how to figure that out, but they say you need to figure that out for the student. You need to find a way for them to drop the class and not be penalized, but also maintain their visa at the same time. And again, it's talking about all responsible employees. When we're talking about the mandated reporting piece, when you're getting a disclosure and you have to report that, letting them know before they continue on. And so we already sort of ran through that. If somebody's coming to you to disclose, saying, this is what I have to do with this information. I have to fill out this disclosure form. This is the only information that it's going to have on it. Even if you want to let them see the form so they feel a little bit more comfortable, that's also important as well.
Question. If that's the case, should this be part of the material that's just in all our course syllabi, a statement that in fact we are all mandated reporters?
Yes, we can have that.
I mean, because it seems like, because we inadvertent, like I say, this comes up in just things, and there'd be no way to announce it ahead of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
To prevent it being said if they didn't want it. So it seems like at the very least, we'll have to do
I can come up with some language over the summer, and I can.
Yeah. I have a hand back there.
Yeah, if you're doing that, you might as well also include that statement, all the resources that are available.
Yeah. And that's great. Honestly, I love that you all came up with those suggestions. Anyways, that's important information to have.
And even though our focus is already way too low down, the paragraph, that might give us an occasion to talk about it those first couple days as well. Just, say it in advance, because as you say, once you get the paper, and, but also, it will just help us to kind of just say that in general to the whole class. So even though I know our syllabus has a lot attached to it, maybe one more paragraph.
I think it's important.
Absolutely. I think those are all great suggestions. You all are awesome. I've heard those people come with those suggestions before. And so then we also have in Connecticut, by far, we are the leaders in the campus sexual assault legislation. Our campus sexual assault legislation surpasses any other state in the country, but really sort of meets not only OCR best practices, but sort of nationally best practices around college, around campuses involving sexual assault. And so a couple of things that, one, it applies to students and employees, as well as Title IX applies to students and employees. Employees are sexually assaulted as well, they have those same protections as well. One, it talks about increases sort of reporting to the higher ed committee. They were really we want to know what's going on. Because nobody likes being sort of blindsided, the more and more a lot of these campus sexual assault cases have been coming up. And it requires annual awareness and prevention activities. Yeah, and so this week. And so the difference between, and it's also important to think about the difference between awareness and prevention. So a Take Back the Night event, that's an awareness event. We're talking about sexual violence. But prevention can be through like an online course. It can be like, all right, we have a bystander intervention program, like where do you stand? That's the prevention piece as well. OCR and Connecticut legislature, we want folks to really be active in preventing sexual violence and not sort of this victim blaming prevention that we were talking about earlier, right? It also talks about all options for victims, including anonymous reporting, needs to be included in concise written info in plain language. Like I said, I went to your website and I found it really quick and really easily, and that's what we want. We want information that if I'm in crisis, that I don't have to like dig through the student handbook and find all this different like legalese language. I need plain language. Who do I talk to? Who can I call? What are my options? And that's really important. It also has really clear guidelines for campus response teams. Like they talk about one, you need to have like a campus response team, who needs to be on it. And so campus response teams are really important, and that these are a group of folks from not only on the campus, but from the community that come together and make sure that students here have the best services as possible. And so it's really about encouraging this collaboration and meeting regularly. So not only before, like after things happen, but before they happen. And even some of them do like case reviews after an assault goes through. They're like, okay, what were the barriers that this student faced? How can we address those? And having those teams are so important. Campuses must have MOUs with both sexual assault and domestic violence programs, which I know you all also have. Again, it's everything that's encouraging that cross-training and that collaboration. Is that we can't all work in silos, right? We can't work in our own bubbles. We really need to work together. And then finally, really, you talked about the victim-centered response and the trauma-informed response must be trained on and implemented for everyone. And so it's really great legislation. It's been difficult to enact in some places, but it's really important. And honestly, a lot of states are looking at Connecticut trying to model their legislation off of ours.
How would you say we're doing as a hiring community?
Like Tunxus in particular?
For that law, yeah.
I think you all are doing well.
Not just Tunxus,
But in general, I think, honestly, it depends. Like, some schools are really on top of it, have really clear, concise things, like it's really easy to go to their websites and find this information, because that's also important, is having this information on your website. A lot of students aren't trying to go to offices and find pamphlets, but having it on the website. And so I say the vast majority of schools are doing well. Some are very resistant, like, to it, and so they're struggling a little bit. But the vast majority of folks recognize that this is an important issue and are willing to put in the work. I think, honestly, like, as we go on, like, states are going to continue to look at Connecticut for a model of what to do. Because it's just important. This is the right thing to have. And it seems very daunting, it's particularly in the beginning of implementation, but ultimately it's just going to make everything so much easier for everyone. Okay. And again, remember, survivors have experienced trauma. It may take time to disclose or report their sexual assault. The International Chiefs of Police said it takes on average 2 years for folks to report a sexual assault. We found some research on colleges says about 6 months to 4 years. Like, it takes time. It's not a Law and Order SVU. Survivors may have multiple needs, and being able to pay attention to those is important. And again, we already talked about, your response can have a lasting impact. And so similarly, we spend a lot of time worrying about like a wrong response, but that right response, survivors hold on to. I've talked to people who are like, my third grade teacher I talked to, and they were so nice, they were so supportive, and that's what they hold on to get them through rough times. And so it's very daunting worrying about saying the wrong thing, but when you say the right thing or just being there is so important. And again, if you don't know, you can ask for help. There's never a problem asking anyone for help. Just saying, listen, I'm not really sure right now, but I know who to ask. And I'll get back to you, or do you want to come with me? Like, that's so important. Questions?
So this is sort of a silly question, but why are campuses the middleman at all? Why isn't every sexual assault treated as a criminal case?
Because not everybody wants to. So that's one part, right? And so thinking again about what do survivors want. And so a lot of times they're like, listen, I don't necessarily want to go to the police. I don't actually want my perpetrator arrested. I just need not to be in a class with them. A lot of folks absolutely do not want to report to the police. And so it's about, this is your community, so how can you make your community as safe as possible and support them? And that's hard, because a lot of folks are like, go report to the police. But when you look at out of, only about 20% of cases get reported to the police, only about a quarter of those ever get, move on to an arrest. Even less when we're talking about prosecution and conviction. Connecticut has a very high plea bargaining rate. And so if folks are getting arrested and prosecuting, they're not getting any time, they're on probation, different things like that. And so I've worked with survivors before who are like, listen, I did this already. I was sexually assaulted before, I filed a report, I went through this entire process, it was rough, and then nothing happened. And I still see my perpetrator. So I don't want to go through that all again. So it's important.
I've never had anybody report assault, but I did have somebody that's given some years back report sexual harassment. And I recall the first thing I asked her was whether she had danger of assault.
Mm-hmm.
She said no. Give me whatever advice about try to say. But the question is, what is the right thing to do when in fact someone says, I don't know, maybe.
They say, I don't know.
Somebody says that there could be an assault following through, or as a result of the questions. What do you say to that person?
Yeah. And so that would be one, I think you would go to start talking about options, right? And so let's say what do you think, asking them, what do you think would make you feel safer, right? What can we do for you? And thinking about, if they say, well, listen, maybe I don't want to be in the same class, or maybe I need, X, Y, and Z.
It's her employer, actually.
Well, yeah, then you could say, what are the ways that we can work with, the organization to sort of make you safer? And ask them, what do they want? And then also talking to sort of superiors about what are the options? What can we do?
And that's why you can still refer them to contacts,
Mm-hmm.
to call, whether it's a hotline or to go in for counseling, and they can get support services. I think that's one thing we have trouble with here. We think that we have to get and solve the student's problem. It could be just simply giving them a phone number of an option.
And that's where those little cards in the back, having some of those little cards that we laid out, that you can just keep in your office so that you can give them to students. There's a lot of resource material in the back where Peter's sitting. I see Peter there. But yes, and so you have them in your office, or stop by Jessica's office or my office, because we have all that information.
And I'm also going to put up the flyers outside room 207. That's my designated room. That's the only way I know that I can keep stuff stocked, because I'll go buy it on a regular basis, because sometimes students aren't always comfortable going to the faculty offices to pick up information. So I'm going to try to get it off. It's not going to be in the counseling area. It's going to be in the classroom outside in the hallway. And the Y also has all kinds of trauma groups that meet, and if you notice, I'll post them around, and they have little tags that you can rip off. I always rip off one, because that way someone says that it's been used and it's okay to tear off and get some help.
That's a great idea.
And we also put those in the bathrooms, and you would be surprised how often that they're all torn off in the bathrooms. Carol?
Well, we also have Shindy and Vivian.
Oh, of course, sure.
We can refer students to, and who often will make phone calls for the students while the student is in the office.
Absolutely.
Because sometimes if you give a number to the student, they may be reluctant to call up.
Absolutely. That's so important, that piece of being able to sit with them while they make the call, or even giving names. And so that's really important, is getting to know your local advocates and saying, listen, this is a name, call Elise, right? And not just call this random number, right?
I've had another situation in the semester, and that was really interesting. A student of mine had to give up my class, she said, because she was in nature, she had to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I tried to see what was going on. She says, I can't talk about it. And I said, well, what is it? She said, I don't ask for help. I don't do that. That's not something I do.
Yeah.
So I was concerned for her, really, because she said she had to leave right now. I mean, it was really a bad situation.
Yeah.
And I said, so I tried to tell her, well, you should go to the counseling office to talk about it, but she didn't disclose to me.
Yeah.
And so I was able to walk her over there, but then she refused to make an appointment, and they were very nice at the counseling center. They tried to get her to make an appointment. They gave her towels and everything, but she said she couldn't, and she left.
Yeah. And that's the hard part, right? And so that's the hard part, is that you can't always help everyone, right? And that feels horrible. I've been there. That feels absolutely horrible when someone's just like, listen, I don't want to call. I don't want to do any of this. I need to go, right? And so that you did everything right. Walking to the counseling center, I think was even better. That's amazing. and you can just give them the information, and if they don't take it, like, ultimately, you've done all you can, and that's really hard to sort of like stomach, but that's what's important.
One of the tricky scenarios that I can see happening is a 17-year-old student who's
Mhm.
enrolled here,
Yeah,
discloses, and, there are all kinds of legal issues with
Yeah.
that about reporting to DCF. Can you kind of walk us through how we would deal with that?
and so that's the hard part. So they're 17 again, talking about like, listen, I'm a mandated reporter, and so I'm someone that I hated. Like growing up, like reporting, like calling DCF was like the worst thing you could ever do to anybody, right? And so when I came into doing a rec service, like that was one of the biggest things that I needed to get over is my fear of reporting to DCF. And so what I will always tell people is that one, I always have the conversation. This is why I have to report this information. Like I'm legally mandated. But here's the information that DCF wants to know. And this is the information that DCF will most likely act on. They need to know that if there is someone like the parent or guardian is assaulting a child or giving someone access to assault them. Like those are the cases where they really sort of step in. And so I say, like, listen, this is what they're looking for. I'm not saying that they're not going to do a further investigation, but this is what typically they're going to look for. This is the information they ask for. They ask for your name. They ask for where you live, the parent's name. They ask who the perpetrator was, what happened, and how help was sought, right? And so I always say, this is the information that they're going to give, and this is what I'm going to tell them. So you can be with me while I sit there, and if you have any fears, we can talk to someone about that. Like DCF is really big on sort of breaking down the stigma of DCF, and so they have people that will talk to them about that. And so it is really like sort of wrecking, like, oh, I have to call DCF, but just letting them know, this is why I have to give this information. You can download the DCF form, it's the DC 136, I think you have some.
Well, what we decided, we talked about in the campus resource team, I understand a lot of people are not going to be comfortable calling DCF and, oh my God, I don't know if there's information. So what we talked about the campus resource team is if you have someone that is under 17 or 18, tell me, I can make the report, okay? If, and I know we talked to that, you're not sure they're 18 and we don't have that identification, if you think they're under 18, fill out the report, put DCF question mark, I can look up that information and find out if a report needs to be made. That way, the onus is not going to be on you. I will take care of it. And what we're going to do is, because we talked to the campus resource team, the DCF number that we called can take a long time.
Oh, yeah.
Farmington Police will work with us because they have the direct hotline.
Mhm.
So I'm going to contact the police, and they're going to make the report so it gets done quickly and properly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you very much.